What was the impact of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal on American life? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another Libertarian Angle.
Good to see you and to be once more with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. All right, Richard, one of the shibboleths in public schools, colleges and universities, economics classes, mainstream commentators in the newspaper is Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. I mean, the standard narrative is that Roosevelt saved America's free enterprise system with his New Deal policies, and that the idea was that capitalism failed with the stock market crash in 1929. It brought untold misery to America, and that it was only Roosevelt's intervention that saved America's free enterprise. And thank goodness that he did. And so now we have the legacy of the New Deal, which is the welfare state, the managed economy, which now is the new economic system that saved America's free enterprise system. Now, Richard, the way I look at this is just pure nonsense, absolute total nonsense. And of course, I'm not the first libertarian to say this or the first libertarian economist who has said this. You got, the whole Austrian school that has detailed the failures of and the horrors of Roosevelt's New Deal. One of my favorite books, I think you reviewed this book many years ago for the Future of Freedom Foundation, is called Three New Deals by Wolfgang Schimmelbusch. And the thesis of this book, which I would recommend to everybody, you can still buy it, is that Roosevelt's New Deal was really just a variation of what Benito Mussolini was doing in fascist Italy and what Adolf Hitler was doing in the 1930s to get Germany out of the Depression. It was a combination of socialism and fascism. And that's precisely why the Supreme Court ended up declaring much of the New Deal, not all of it, but much of it unconstitutional, sort of alien to the American way of life. This put Roosevelt into a real tizzy where he threatened to pack the court with his cronies so that his statist nonsense unconstitutional. But really, Richard, as Murray Rothbard, Hayek, Mises, and others have pointed out, the stock market crash was not the failure of free enterprise in 1929. It was the failure of the Federal Reserve, which had come into existence in 1913. They'd had their easy money policy during all of the 1920s, and this was when we were still in the gold standard. And then when people started panicking, thinking, oh, there's not enough gold in there to honor all this paper money they were printing, they started demanding gold, and that caused the Fed to panic, over-contract the paper money that they had issued, or paper instruments of indebtedness, and that's what caused the stock market crash. And Roosevelt just used that as the excuse to totally transform America's way of life. In the name of saving free enterprise, he converted America into what we call a welfare state, which is a variation of a socialist system, as well as a fascist system, a government-managed system, a government-controlled, regulated economy. And we're still living with that legacy today. I mean, that's when Social Security got established. This welfare plan for seniors that has made practically, or at least most seniors, hopelessly dependent on it. The entire nation now believes that if you abolish this program, that there'd be people dying in the streets. People have lost their faith in a genuinely free society. And then of course, that inspired Lyndon Johnson to enact his Great Society programs, including Medicare and Medicaid. So here we are today living in a totally different type of economic system that the country was founded on, a genuinely free market capitalist system. And the only difference is that people are indoctrinated with the notion that this is a capitalist free market system. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. What do you think, Richard?
Well, just to slightly make a wider net, it should not be forgotten that the real modern trend towards government political paternalism, intrusiveness into market and social affairs began earlier. you could definitely say that the mark of it beginning was, of course, during Woodrow Wilson's administration, um, from 1912 until 1920, his 2 terms in office. He oversaw the establishment of the income tax, the Federal Reserve System. He got America into the First World War when no country had attacked us or invaded us, but felt there was a moral crusade for the United States to make the world safe for democracy, which resulted in a regimentation of the US economy under wage, price, and production regulations, a repression of civil liberties. And it's worth keeping in mind that who was uh, Woodrow Wilson's Undersecretary of the Department of the Navy during World War I? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And therefore, Wilson was an inspiration and an ideal for the Roosevelt who, after serving as governor in New York, ended up being elected the president of the United States in the 1932 election. It's also worth pointing out is that Roosevelt really didn't begin the anti-Great Depression government interventions. That was done by Herbert Hoover, who had become president in 1929, having won the 1928 election after Calvin Coolidge's 2 terms. And he's the one who instituted what was called pressures on the private sector not to adjust prices and wages to post-bubble market rebalancing circumstances. He's the one who introduced public works, deficit spending to try to fight the Depression. But the fact is that all of these had failed. These government interventions had failed. And when Roosevelt ran for the presidency in 1932, he ran on a Democratic Party platform that had been approved and declared to be the Democratic Party's position at their convention in 1932. And in fact, what was that platform? It was called for cuts in government spending, a reduction of taxes, a balancing of the budget, a maintenance of a solid gold standard, and a respect by the federal government for the traditional federalism of states' autonomies in managing their own local affairs as delegated under the division of powers of the Constitution. And that is the platform that Franklin Roosevelt ran on in 1932. Of course, what he did after taking office back then, presidents were inaugurated in March of the year, not January as now. But when he took power in the White House in March of 1933, he proceeded to introduce a whole series of policies, the exact opposite of what his party platform had promised the American people just a few months earlier when they were going to the voting booths. He did follow a model, as you were just suggesting, Jacob, of a corporativist or fascist type model. He had advisors, he had staff members, he has policy advocates who called for this. In fact, the president of General Electric Company was a man named Gerald Swope. And in the 1931-32, he had written a book called The Swope Plan, which was an inspiration for some of Roosevelt's advisors. And what Gerald Swope called for was the U.S. to fight the Depression, to consciously introduce elements of Mussolini's corporate economy. And what was the fascist model in Italy? Well, it was mandating that all businesses must join and participate and being controlled by government-mandated cartels. Labor would be put into government-mandated and overseen labor unions. And through these government-overseen and regulated cartels and union structures, the government would basically determine prices, wages, production levels, and the distribution of the output to different sectors of the economy. It was basically a centrally planned economy, which the only difference from what was going on in the Soviet Union was that rather than fully nationalizing the means of production and placing them directly under government control, like the post office, in fascist Italy, and then under the National Socialists, the Nazis, when Hitler came to power, property was kept nominally in private hands. A businessman on paper still owned his company, but the government basically told him what to produce, what quantity to produce, what price he could sell his output at, what wages and work conditions he had to be compelled to provide to his workforce. Basically, it was the businessman became a manager obeying the government's orders. And that's what was introduced. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration in the first half of 1933, the implementation of the National Adjustment Recovery Act, what became known as NRA, which basically then compelled businesses into government-mandated cartels where prices and wages and outputs were fixed. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, which had its parallel in farming, where the government determined and mandated farmers what crops they could grow, what livestock they could raise, the quantities, the types, what prices at which they could be sold, the wages and work conditions of those they employed in the countryside, massive public works projects, just as Hitler ended having the public works projects of building the Autobahn system, their version of an interstate highway system. Roosevelt then introduced vast public works projects in the United States. One version of which was the famous Tennessee Valley Authority in the mid-1930s. Huge ecological transformation of the middle states from Ohio down into Mississippi and Alabama to try to control the waterworks and create electrification in the countryside under government control and mandate. There was even public works projects for artists and writers. Still today, you can go into some post offices that were constructed or remodeled in the 1930s, and you will occasionally find these murals that were made by American artists as part of their public works jobs, in which these murals of happy workers in the factories, happy farmers on their tractors, almost a cliche copy of the type of propaganda art that one found in the Soviet Union at that time under Stalin. Happy workers on the collective farms. And the result is that the Depression was not overcome. The jobs that were created were artificial, paid for through either taxes on some members of the society still employed, or through deficit spending, ultimately through paper money creation, in a setting in which price inflation could not be set going as an increase in paper money and credit would tend to do, because you had all these price and wage regulations through these fascist type controls of industry and agriculture. But nonetheless, the Depression just continued to go on. The only thing that protected us from having a permanent fascist style economy was the fact that a series of cases came before the Supreme Court, as I know you as a lawyer are very well familiar with, in 1935 and 1936, in which it was asked and argued that these regulations interfered with the principles of private enterprise and interstate commerce. What authority has the government to control these things when it only goes on within the boundaries of a state? The result is that through a series of decisions, the Supreme Court unanimously, I think in every case, as I remember, basically declared the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and a variety of others unconstitutional. And fortunately, there was still enough respect for rule of law that Roosevelt basically had to dismantle these things. Now, that did not stop his attempt to still micromanage the economy, denied his ability to maintain a fascist style structure on the society. He then just blithely went on his way with introducing various types of regulatory programs, redistributive programs, even more deficit spending to create artificial and therefore wasteful jobs in the name of fighting unemployment. And of course, among the greatest ones at this time was in 1935, the Social Security Administration, this government-imposed retirement system in which people were to have portions of their income extracted from them under the compulsion of taxation, with supposedly the promise that they'll get their money back when they reach the government-mandated retirement age. Now, one of the things that I should point out is that the retirement age was mandated to be 65 years old. Now, why did the government set 65 instead of 55 or 50 or 60? Because at that time, life expectancy was barely 65 years old. So you'd be paying into a system, and in the actuarial sense, you were likely to be dead by the time you were eligible to collect. Now, that sounds humorous today, but it was an element in their deciding what the system would be able to afford if it was implemented. Uh, and this is the legacy that Franklin Roosevelt left. And of course, then in the late 1930s, with war clouds in both Asia and Europe, and then finally war breaking out in Europe in 1939, the US was sucked into the Second World War in December of 1941. And Roosevelt proceeded to impose a truly centrally planned economy with wage and price controls, government direction of all production, rationing of virtually every imaginable consumer good and resource good in the US economy, which generated vast black markets, and basically reducing the US economy to a system of government controlled and overseen total war. In fact, my article for the January issue of FFF's publication, Future of Freedom, is on Franklin Roosevelt's bogus Economic Bill of Rights. Because what was it now? It would be like, 80 years ago this January, Roosevelt, in fact, delivered his State of the Union address in which he called for two things: that America must be more fully mobilized to fight total war against the total war of Nazi Germany, and then for the post-war era, a new economic bill of rights that will secure not just your freedom of speech and freedom of press. That's the old fogey freedoms. We need a new progressive arena of freedom. And this would be guaranteeing everybody a right to a job, right to decent housing, right to decent medical care, decent recreation and entertainment, a fair wage, a guaranteed profit margin. In other words, he wanted to reinstitute the planned economy with a vengeance once World War II was over. And that's the ideas that are the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt as president during the years of the Great Depression.
Well, you've raised a lot of great issues, and your point about the Industrial Recovery Act is just right on. I mean, it's straight out of the Benito Mussolini playbook. You know, this idea of cartels, and each industry sets its own wages and prices, and it's enforced by law. I mean, that's classism, fascism to the core. But what was also interesting, Richard, is the climate of intimidation. I mean, there was a lot of fear that if you didn't get on board with this thing and you weren't a businessman, they would come after you. There's that infamous Blue Eagle that was the emblem of the National Recovery Act. And it was run by a general. This whole program, I think it was General Johnson or something like that. And that if you didn't display the Blue Eagle in your storefront window, the other businessmen would come in and start really putting you down and calling for boycotts because you were not being an American. This is the type of thing that happens in a fascist society. And then when people started realizing what a catastrophe this government program was economically, they were saying, oh, you can't end it just at once. Oh, no, we got to gradually reduce it because that would produce chaos. Well, on the day the Supreme Court declares the NIRA unconstitutional, that's it. From one to the next day to the next, Richard, it's over. It's gone. And immediately, none of the predictions of catastrophe arose. It was the exact opposite. There was an immediate revitalization of the American economy. But that decision, along with others, as you pointed out, were making Roosevelt so angry that that's what motivated him to do his court packing scheme, where he was going to add Supreme Court justices that would enable him to carry through his program without any obstruction. And the four justices who were really heroic, defending the real founding principles of the Constitution and the country, were called the Four Horsemen. I think it was Butler, Sutherland, Vandevanner, and McReynolds. And the swing justice was Roberts. But with all this hullabaloo, with the court packing scheme and so forth, Roberts switches. It was a 5-4 decision there, and Roberts switches over. Before this, the Supreme Court had declared the minimum wage unconstitutional. Imagine that. So you can't interfere with liberty of contract between an employer and employee in our country. And so in 1937, West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, it all comes to an end. The Roberts shifts. And he always defended himself by saying, well, it wasn't really a shift. This is the way he always believed. But regardless, the Supreme Court declares the minimum wage to be constitutional after all. They overrule the previous cases. And from that point on, with retirements of the Four Horsemen or people dying, everything shifted permanently in Roosevelt's direction. And I think it's also worth pointing out his gold confiscation scheme. I mean, this is one of the most horrific things ever in the history of this country, where the Constitution called for gold and silver coins as the official money. I mean, you can see that today in the Constitution. No state shall make anything but gold and silver legal tender. There was no power to issue paper money. The states were prohibited from issuing what were called bills of credit, which was paper money. Roosevelt just unilaterally abolishes the system. No constitutional amendment at all. He says that, oh, it's an emergency, and therefore I have the power to do this. So he decrees paper money to be the official money. He nationalizes gold. I mean, this is straight out of a totalitarian playbook. He orders every American to turn in his gold. He gets Congress to go along with this deal. If you don't turn in your gold and you're caught, it's a felony offense. And they actually went after wealthy people that were, putting their money in gold. This was the official money. That had been the official money for more than 100 years. And now it's a felony to own what had been the official money. They targeted them with criminal prosecution. And so everybody was terrified to death. I would venture to say most people rushed into turning their gold, where they got irredeemable paper money, promises to pay gold. And immediately after they did that, he devalues the paper that they exchanged for their gold. It was a straight stealing scheme. But that's how we ended up with this system, where you've got monetary debauchery decade after decade after decade, because when they don't have enough money through taxes to fund their little welfare warfare state schemes, or I should say their big welfare warfare state schemes, that's when they resort to the printing press. Just keep printing the money. People will blame it on businessmen and capitalists for raising their prices. They'll never suspect that the government's behind this scheme. So this guy has left us a horrific legacy, Richard. The socialism, fascism, paper money. I mean, it's been a real horror story as far as the history of this country is concerned.
Yeah, he deified through a good part of the last 90 years. As the president who saved America, who got us out of the Great Depression, who was assured a smooth path back to prosperity, and then saved the world from tyranny, in spite of the imagery that has been created by the history books, by the media, by the social pundits on the op-ed pages of so many newspapers over the decades. The fact was that he was an opportunist, power-lusting president. Now, in many ways, he was not an ideologue in the way you would think of a Hitler or a Stalin or Lenin, for example. Oh, he has this master plan to intentionally create, a fascist or a communist America. The perversity and perhaps even in the damaging aspects of him is that he was basically a power-hungry, pragmatic opportunist. There's a story that at one of his press conferences that he would hold in the Oval Office, a reporter asked him, Mr. President, some people call you a fascist. Some people call you a communist, a socialist. What are you? And according to the account that I read in one of the anti-Roosevelt history books, is that Roosevelt seemed to be bewildered by the question. And he said, well, I'm just a Democrat and a Christian. But I should say that his notion of what a Christian is was a little bizarre, because when he returned from the Yalta Conference of February 1945, having met with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to decide on how the post-World War would be centrally planned by them on the international stage, he had a meeting with his cabinet members to report on the conference. This is reported in these transcripts, that he said, I like Stalin better every time I meet him. There's something of the Christian gentleman in him. Well, if Stalin is the definition of a Christian gentleman, then I have no idea what he meant when he said, I'm just a Democrat and a Christian. But that just shows the perversity of that.
Well, another humorous aspect of this in a dark sense was when Hitler writes Roosevelt a letter commending him on his economic policies. And he says, "You and I are on the same page. We are putting the public good ahead of the private selfish interests of the individual." And it was true. They were, and this is the book I mentioned earlier by Wolfgang Schimmelbusch, Three New Deals. That there's a lot of similarities between Roosevelt's policies, Hitler's, and those of Mussolini. I think we'd be remiss also, Richard. We've talked about this in other shows where we've talked about immigration, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that Roosevelt used immigration controls to prevent Jews from escaping from Germany and coming to the United States. A lot of people don't realize that Hitler in the 30s was willing to let Jews go, but no country was willing to take them, including the United States. And when they asked Roosevelt about this, would you open the door here? Because he's using the system of immigration controls to block these Jews from coming in. He goes, "Oh, no, we have the quota system." And what he was referring to is that a certain quota of immigrants for Germany had been allocated and had already been filled. And so those German Jews would just have to stay there in Germany, where, of course, we all know what happened to them. And then there's that infamous Voyage of the Damned, great movie with Faye Dunaway and others, based on a true story, where this German cruise ship filled with Jewish refugees goes to Havana Harbor. They said, "No, we don't want any more Jews here." They started headed to Miami Harbor, and the Roosevelt administration put out the order, "Not one Jew will be permitted to jump ship. Send them back." And so I think it's another dark side of Roosevelt's legacy, because he's always portrayed as the guy that loves the poor, needy, and disadvantaged.
Yes, in fact, in just filling the German quota of immigration, anyone who applied had to have, along with their exit visa issued by the German government, a document of good conduct to show that the U.S. would see them as a good and loyal individual. Well, the Gestapo was not going to issue a certificate of good character and conduct to a German Jew. So how do you even get the paperwork that the US government demands, specifying that you're a good person in the eyes of the Germans? So this was one of the most despicable aspects of Roosevelt's policies. The fact is that I may have the numbers slightly wrong, but in all of those years of the 1930s and into the beginning, when the U.S. entry into war, the Second World War, prohibited any ability for immigrants from Germany to come to the United States, obviously, only about 250,000 legal refugees came to the United States from Europe, when the numbers who were clamoring to leave, and not just Jews, but those who were intellectuals or liberals more in our sense, or even, to be honest, anti-Nazi socialists, anyone who was a target of the Nazis who wanted to escape to America, the door was barred to them. The door was barred to them. They were left to just either hide or be destroyed by the Nazis. After one country after another was conquered by the German army as the Second World War progressed in Europe, with their fate sealed because our door was closed in their face.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that one of the real heroes of our movement, the Libertarian movement, Austrian Economics, Ludwig von Mises, was Jewish, and that he was targeted by the Hitler regime. I mean, they practically were chasing him across Europe as he was escaping to come to the United States. Fortunately, he was one of those that made it, unlike so many others that got trapped there.
Yes, in fact, his friends in the United States, including Henry Hazlitt, who had not met him but had only come to know him through correspondence over several years, since Hazlitt had reviewed his book on socialism when it had appeared in English for the New York Times. Uh, a non-existent teaching position was arranged for him at the University of California at Berkeley, so that he could have on his visa application to enter the United States that he would have a job, that he was an economist, an academic, and he would have a job to come to, when in fact that was all a ruse just to get around all of the barriers to someone like him coming to the United States. And of course, he was a target of the Nazis. First, he was an old-fashioned classical liberal who was a public and outspoken enemy of both Soviet communism and German Nazism, and he was Jewish. And if he had not been able to escape to the United States, one can only imagine what would have been his fate.
We don't need to imagine. They would have killed him just immediately. He'd have been at the top of the list on both counts, that he was a libertarian, free market advocate, and as well as Jewish. Okay, Richard, we're out of time. Hey, greatly enjoyed the conversation, Richard. Thank you for taking your time to share your perspectives with us. And thank you all for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you all next week. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.